Hey, all you people, Snakes in Maine here. Um, I've been sitting on a review of Silent Hill 2 Remake for quite a while now, wondering how I was going to tackle it. I at least wanted to do some sort of review on it that wasn't just some shitty, quick little write up, because I had so many things to say about it, but at the same time, I have so many projects lined up for this channel that I just could not squeeze another one in. So, with that in mind, I decided to take a bit of a gamble with this video. And the gamble in question was to not write a script or provide really any footage. Yeah, it's a bit of a risk, but I'm going to try it. This video is going to be as raw as the sex our ancestors had. No script, no footage, partly because of the whole project stint, but also because I didn't even get the idea to make a video on this until I was about three-quarters of the way through the remake, and I thought, yeah, this game is just not hidden for me, so I want to make a video trashing it, just absolutely ripping it to shreds. And then, as I'm sitting here thinking, where do I begin? Because Bloober Hill 2, as I like to call it, because, who it was developed by, Bloober Hill 2 has a lot of problems, a lot of problems. There are some things about the game that I think were done well. I could even say were done great. I think the fog is pretty good. I think the general art style as a whole is pretty good, even in the midst of all, like, how poorly adapted the gameplay was, the story was, and just the general presentation was. Whoever, someone on Bloober Hill at least knew what the original was trying to do, at least aesthetically, because the game looks really good. Doesn't play very good because I got a single digit frames often, despite the fact that I have a pretty decent rig, but that's beside the point. The game looks good, but in terms of basically anything else, I thought this game was a rather poor adaptation. The gameplay loop, for instance, is terrible. It's atrocious. It's so fucking bad. Not because the game is just generally unfun. I mean, it is. It's not fun to play at all. But because it wears its influences on its sleeve. No, no, actually, no. That's too much of a compliment. It wears its influences on its forehead. It writes down Resident Evil 4 was my inspiration on a billboard and then slaps that shit on its forehead and walks around the city streets just telling you, "Hey man, Resident Evil 4 did good. Let's just do what that game did." And I'm not being facetious when I say that because the main combat loop is tit for tat the exact fucking same as Resident Evil 4 Remake. You shoot an enemy in the kneecaps, and then you follow it up with a melee attack where the game graciously locks onto the enemy whenever you hit the enemy's weakness and follow that shit up with the melee attack. And I shit you not, this is how combat's gonna go for you throughout all the 15 to 20 hours that you spend playing this game. It's it's absolutely predictable and boring and just generic and all that shit. And I know, you can complain all you want about the original's combat system, but the way I see it, the original's combat is vastly superior, and that's for a number of reasons. Maybe not on a technical level because it's still got that good old PS2 clunkiness to it, but many people don't realize this about the original's combat, but it had some subtlety in the mechanics and shit like that, mainly pertaining to the melee weapons. Where in the remake, pretty much you have like one melee option, and that's just a regular swing that you just beat the goddamn enemies like they're a fucking pinata. But in the original, you at least had some options in how to deal with the enemy. For instance, with the pipe, just a quick press would just jab the enemy and knock them back so you can run past them. But holding down the attack button will do an overhead that has a greater chance of knocking them down and killing them. It comes at the expense of a few extra frames, but with that, you have a more guaranteed shot at knocking the enemy down and killing them for good, so you don't have to deal with them anymore. Compared to the quick and easy jab to push them off you so you can run past them. And about that, in the original, you at least had the option to run past them. When in the remake, you have several forced combat encounters. And I wouldn't complain about that, except, again, the combat is just not that good. It's not that fun when you have the same strategy for all the enemies. It becomes a very cumbersome experience when there's only like one viable way to deal with the enemies, a one viable, quick, no tension having ass way of dealing with the enemies. It's just very inconsequential and very boring. It gets boring very quick. Let me like hammer that in. Again, it's literally Resident Evil 4 slash Dead Space slash Last of Us. If you played either of those three games, you basically understand what Silent Hill 2 remake is all about. It's yeah, not good, man. Not good at all. Also, the combat feels very weird for a game like Silent Hill 2. It does feel weird on a technical level because the dodge and the melee attacks still feel really clunky. Not in that old PS2 kind of way, but more in the modern, completely over animated to shit type of way. But just like in a general sense, the combat does not feel like it should be in a Silent Hill 2 game, remake or not. It should not even be in a Silent Hill 2 game, period, remake or not. Because, motherfucker, James has these crazy ass dodge cancels and attack cancels and all this weird, crazy tech shit. And it points to a larger issue that I had with this remake, and where it feels less concerned with adapting the material of the original properly, and instead just ham-fisting whatever's been popular with video games in the past 10 years, 10 to 15 years. The game's perspective and camera systems are where you feel this the most. You see, in the original, it didn't quite have these dynamic camera angles that the original Resident Evil trilogy had, but it did have this sort of like middle ground between full control camera and the dynamic angle camera. But the way it was constantly positioned almost felt as if it felt less like a camera and more like a creature or some phantom, some supernatural force that wasn't quite following James, but more so surveying his every move, just watching him, making sure that he comes to terms with the fact that he murdered his wife. Spoiler alert, by the way. In case you haven't played this 23-year-old game, sorry, spoiler. Whoops. Anyway, the camera system in the original was great. It was instrumental in providing this constant sense of tension and dread that made the original as scary as it was. But of course, since Bloober Hill 2 is again more concerned with adapting modern techniques rather than the techniques that were prevalent in the original, the game is of course going to have another over the shoulder perspective that doesn't even feel like it's over the shoulder, more like inside your asshole most of the time. I cannot stress enough how bad the camera was in tracking the character, especially during combat scenarios where, believe me, in like the Brookhaven apartment section, this is where you feel it the most because, of course, it's all tight and claustrophobic, and of course, there's plenty of fast-paced combat encounters here, plenty of chaotic ones where you're dishing out a lot, where you're fighting a lot of enemies at once, and you can barely even see what's going on sometimes because the camera is so smushed into James's backside that you again you can't see what the fuck you're doing. And again, it's weird because the original had a perfect camera system. You could control it if you want to. You can control it to be an top-down sort of camera if you wanted to, but you could also let the game do its own thing and provide you with perfect angles that presents everything in a sort of like cinematic way. Also, not detracting from any combat encounters that you would come across. They were basically perfect. The atmosphere was tangible. The game allowed you to really soak in the vibes that each and every location offered. But of course, the remake doesn't do this. Instead, you get the same boring and generic over the shoulder perspective that doesn't even work half the time. It's bad, man. And you also feel this pretty hard with the soundscapes and soundtrack, because in the original there were plenty of instances where the game was just dead silent, again allowing you to really take in the game's atmosphere. The game had a very sparse music, and in between those bits of silence, you also had these really eerie and pound and industrial slash dark ambient soundscapes that really just made your skin crawl. Like, this game was effective as hell with its music. Replace that with this stock noise that the remake gives you, and there's just no comparison, man. One is like almost objectively better than the other, in this regard at least. And in terms of adapting the some of the songs that were present in the original, it does exactly what Persona 3 Reload does, and just strips it away of all of its very interesting, quirky aesthetics. And they just sound completely flat, just devoid of dynamics. It sounds just like overly polished and overly produced and overly professional, which for a game like Silent Hill 2 doesn't really work at all. And speaking of overly polished and overly produced, we now get to move on to the presentation of the story. I'm not going to talk about the story that much because, let's face it, it's basically the same. There's a few additional cutscenes that don't amount to much, other than furthering this whole time loop theory that fans have been going with, that this remake seems to really be pushing. If the flashbacks that were constantly hammered in weren't enough. Anyway, the story's largely the same. The script is largely the same. It's just the overall presentation that feels extremely lackluster when you compare it to the original. Like, I know a lot of people are gonna get in my case, but like for like the voice acting in the original is so bad, man. Which, I mean, it's not. It's really fucking good in communicating the whole surreal, dreamlike vibe it was going for. Yes, the characters were voiced by professional voice actors who knew what they were doing. The manner in which they speak in was a deliberate decision to make the game feel kind of Lynchian. If you've played, if you watch anything like Twin Peaks or Lost Highway or Blue Velvet or any of those weird surreal Lynch-esque vibes, I mean, any of those surreal Lynch-esque films and TV series, then you basically can understand what they were going for here. And if you haven't, well, then of course you're just going to hear really shitty, archaic PS2 era voice acting, which it's a misconception that I'm getting increasingly fucking sick of and tired of hearing. Because it just shows that you really don't have a clue what you're talking about, and you're vastly inexperienced in more abstract art house types of media. With that out of the way, the remake is, of course, again, very, very polished, very, very professional, to the game's detriment. I understand what the game was going for and making it more like modern and more accessible to a modern audience, but all it does is end up detracting from, again, the sort of surreal and horror atmosphere that was present in the original. It gets especially terrible when you realize that the voice performances in the remake are kind of one note. You see, again, in the original, there was subtlety, there was nuance in the way the characters delivered their lines. For instance, James had this underlying bitterness, and Angela had this underlying sense of childishness, and Eddie had this underlying sense of sinistry and cynicism and all that shit. But all these qualities are kind of whisked away when you have these multi-million-dollar actors portraying these roles in a very straightforward and loud and unsubtle and again completely one-note ways. It gets to the point where everything regarding these characters is extremely obvious from the get-go, and and even worse, it gets to the point where these characters feel completely different than their original counterpart. James is a pretty bad example of this too, because why is he so quippy in this? Why is he such a cocky little bastard in this? When the guy fucking scoffs and cracks a joke when him and Maria go to open up that nasty ass fridge, and I'm just like, dude, who the hell are you? Are you that same guy? No, you're Leon fucking Kennedy again because this game just wants to be Resident Evil 4. It's horrible, man. And by far the worst example of this is the trick or treat guy. Oh my god, I hate this so fucking much. He sounds like Jigsaw now. He just sounds like a really poor attempt at Jigsaw now. It is laughably corny and laughably bad. Again, it just kills all the subtlety and everything that and all the abstract shit that the original had going for. And it gets worse too. It gets worse beyond the voice acting. Because while the story is largely the same, and okay, I'm kind of like getting lost here. Because again, the story is the same, but the way they interpret some of the more important stuff, like boss fights, is again worse. And this is probably like my least favorite part of like how the game was reinterpreted in terms of presentation. Because I'll just list an example right here. You want to know what these boss fights needed? Distinct phases. Yeah, man. You really know what the abstract daddy boss fight really needed? Distinct phases where in between the fights, James is coming across these televisions just playing recorded messages of Angela being abused because this game just can't be subtle about anything. They have to let you know that Angela was abused. Because, again, we can't have subtlety here, man. Those pistons that thrust back and forth in the room of the abstract daddy boss fight, they're gone. I think they're in the ceiling now, but and they're well hidden away from the game, away from the player. But the effect is lost, and instead we have to go with the most loud and blatant and obvious and subtlety devoid method of storytelling possible. And to make matters worse, James has to run through these hallways, these cramped hallways, to further reiterate the fact that, again, abuse. It's very unsubtle, and I feel like my intelligence is being insulted and I hate it so much. The Flesh Lips boss fight is also pretty bad in this case, because instead of fighting three of these caged monsters that you have no choice but to just shoot upward and just pray that that it hits, um, instead you get another phase where this fucking thing transforms into like a spider with like legs that crawls towards you and just tries to jab you with its big fucking metallic spider legs. It's it's so horrible. Why is it like this? Why are we doing everything that that video games are doing now instead of doing what the original did? It's so bad. And yes, the final boss fight with Mary is like this too. Distinct phases. It's the second phase where you get knocked underground and she like jumps through the goddamn ceiling and you gotta avoid her attacks and shoot her and shit. Um, yeah, man, it's so bad. And again, not again. Moving on to hopefully the last thing I have to talk about this game, unless I think about something else. Because if you couldn't tell, I'm just winging it. Um, this game is padded as fuck, like padded to shit. I said earlier that the game which should take you about 15 to 20 hours to beat, and it took me about 17 hours to beat, and I was rushing through it. And you want to know how long the original was? About 6 hours. uh, by the time I by the time I reached like the historical society in the original, I'm at the apartments in the remake. If that doesn't highlight how fucking padded out and just bloated this goddamn game is, then allow me to add in some further criticisms to further elaborate. Um, this game does another thing that the modern Resident Evil remakes like to do, where instead of these like really tricky and very clever puzzles where you have to use actual context clues and actual items in your inventory to solve, they instead do the whole collect key, open door, collect item, open door, fight enemies, collect key, open door, collect key, open items, fight keys, enemies, kill items. Um, yeah, it's literally just like that. You're just collecting keys and just opening doors for 20 hours. I got spittle on my mic. Um, anyway, there are some puzzles, but they're like completely dead fucking obvious. Uh, I'm comparing normal difficulties, by the way, and even in the original on normal difficulty, you still had to pick at your brain a little bit to figure some of these puzzles out. But no, not on the remake. They're dead obvious. They're so easy to solve. It's like I'm playing Silent Hill 2 ABC Mouse Edition. It's bad, man. And again, this game goes on for hours and hours and hours. Anytime it feels like it's about to end and should end, it just keeps going, man. And I don't get it. The Resident Evil 4 remake was the same length, but they were able to reinterpret some areas, extend some others, and add in some new shit without completely padding it the fuck out. I mean, that remake has some flaws, certainly, but it's not that bad in that aspect where the Silent Hill 2 remake is egregious in this aspect. It's probably the worst aspect. Because, like, you can complain about, like, the reinterpreted story and presentation and the combat and everything, but all those things just become exponentially worse when the game is almost 3 times as long as the original. And I think I'm going to leave it there. Yeah, the Silent Hill 2 remake sucks. Video game remakes suck. I'm gonna do a full-fledged review on Persona 3 Reload that should come out February-ish, March-ish. I'm not sure. It should be about late winter, early spring. That's what I'm thinking. And since that game is going to have a script, while this game doesn't, I mean, while that video is going to have a script and this one didn't, and I've trashed this one pretty badly, um, the Persona 3 Reload video should be fun. It should be really, really fun. Um, but again, yeah, remakes suck. I can't stand remakes anymore, especially after playing Persona 3 Reload and seeing the System Shock remake in the midst of playing the originals. And basically, I'm holding out for Rebirth at this point. Rebirth drops out on PC next month, and if that game is anything less than a 7 out of 10, I will officially give up on remakes moving forward. Yes, that includes a Final Fantasy IX remake and maybe the Resident Evil 5 remake, but basically, yeah, remakes have really gotten on my under my skin lately, and I can't stand them now. And it's thanks to games like this where they're just not really concerned or interested in embracing the aspects that made the original good. Instead, they're just kind of taking the original and reskinning it for, I should say, like de-skinning it, just like straight up just like removing everything that made the original so good and so unique, and instead just making it likable. We got to do everything that makes this game likable for people who watch let's plays in the modern day. I yeah. I can't stand the Silent Hill 2 remake. It's not Good. Uh, that's it from me. See you bitches later.